Here we go. You'll get a message. All right. And now turn it over to Stephen.
All right. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Now, the real test, will we advance? Awesome. We are good. Okay. So quick overview of what we're going to cover on these slides. Talk about who I am, what we're going to talk about. Google Analytics, what is it? Talk about some of the differences between Google Analytics 4 and Universal Analytics. Talk about GDPR and privacy considerations related to Google Analytics, and then do a kind of a quick how-to implementation on Google Analytics 4, and then wrap things up, take questions, etc. All right. So intro. I think I passed me. All right. Who am I? Account manager. I've been doing Google Analytics for over a decade. I oversee most of our implementations for clients. So who are you? I've seen a lot of folks have done kind of what they're doing, whether they're in-house or it sounds like a lot of in-house freelance and sort of career change folks, which is awesome. That's one of the great things about web development is you don't necessarily need a degree in it. You can kind of make your own way. And I wondered if folks would maybe drop in the chat kind of their comfort or experience level with Google Analytics, one being maybe you've heard of it, to 5, you pretty much consider yourself a pro with it. Just go ahead, drop that in the chat. Let's move the chat over here. All right, so we got kind of a mixed group here, kind of both ends of the spectrum. That's awesome. So what we'll cover is just what is Google Analytics anyway, talk about the differences between Universal Analytics, which is the old version, and Google Analytics 4, which is the new version. Talk about privacy and how and when to upgrade to Google Analytics 4. So what is Google Analytics? Google Analytics is a free analytics service offered by Google. At its core level, basically you add some JavaScript to your website pages, but it's been around for a while. It was originally kind of based on Urchin on Demand, which was a analytics service that Google bought. And then Google released their own version in 2005. There have been a few subsequent major releases. In 2009, the asynchronous analytics, 2012 Universal Analytics, and 2020 Google Analytics 4. And, why is that important? Well, if you look across all versions, Google Analytics is probably the most commonly used traffic analytics tool in the world. My source for that is W3Techs, and of websites whose traffic analytics tool they could identify, almost 86% were using a version of Google Analytics. So it's pretty much used by most people. So Universal Analytics is kind of the old version, was initially released in 2012. Really best think of it as sort of a refinement or evolution of the over 20-year-old Urchin on Demand technology. When Universal Analytics was released, again, 10 years ago, they added support for cross-platform tracking, app and website tracking, and as well as some ability to customize dimensions and metrics. But at its core, it still retained really the base model. So page views, hits, browser cookie tracking of users. But that meant that historic data was largely compatible with previous versions. So there wasn't a lot of pain to moving from one version to the next. So why are we talking about that? Because Google Analytics 4, which was released in October of 2020, has an entirely new model for tracking analysis. Big important thing is the new model is incompatible with Universal Analytics or earlier models. So there's no direct method for historical comparison between Google Analytics 4 data and Universal Analytics. I mean, you can look at it, you'll see roughly the same shapes, but there's not going to be a one-to-one relationship. And so a lot of folks were like, okay, well, Google Analytics 4 is interesting, but we all know how to do Universal Analytics, so we'll just kind of keep going and maybe run them in parallel and get the extra insights from Analytics 4 technology. And then in March, Google announced that Universal Analytics would no longer track new data starting July 2023. So now everyone that uses Universal Analytics is on a time clock. Google has only committed to supporting access to existing Universal Analytics data through December of 2023. So after December 2023, it's kind of anyone's guess whether Google will kick the can down the road or just shut off all of that old data. So that kind of makes the consideration of upgrading or at least getting off Universal Analytics pretty important. So why do people use Google Analytics? Has a lot of benefits. It's free, so that's pretty huge. Has a really robust feature set, lots of things it can do. And I think kind of in many ways, it's kind of like the industry standard for small and medium-sized organizations. Google had Google Analytics 360 that they really targeted at enterprise size organizations, but they've also announced that's going to sunset. I think the data window for Analytics 360 is a little later than Universal Analytics, but it's going away as well. One of the things I think is most useful about Google Analytics is if you're like, hey, I want to do X or Y or Z, you can Google it. And there are a lot of people who will tell you how to do things in different ways. So there's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of training, there's a lot of best practices. And then if you're using other Google products, Google Tag Manager, Google Ads, Google Search Console, Google Data Studio, all the Google products play really well together. So lots of big benefits there. Concerns, data privacy and ownership. My boss always likes to sum it up as if you are not the customer, you are the product. So again, Google Analytics is free. So you're not paying Google anything. So Google is getting some benefit from you using their free platform that thousands of developer hours have gone into creating and maintaining. And then there are other big concerns with compliance with GDPR, which if folks are not aware of that, it is the General Data Privacy Regulation. I think I got that acronym right. I've got it written down further on, but that's basically the EU's data privacy laws. Google Universal Analytics is definitely not in compliance. It has been ruled not in compliance with GDPR. And the jury's still out on Google Analytics 4. So there are some concerns. So what are the differences between GA4 and Universal Analytics? As an overview, we sort of talked about it. GA4 has kind of a core model of page views, which are hits. And then there's a Google cookie that's dropped that's used to kind of determine session information. And then there are third-party cookies that are also not dropped by Google, but reviewed by analytics to kind of get some demographic information related to users and help with some of their ad targeting and things of that nature. And it's extensible with custom events. If you have a web and an app that you want to track, they have to be separate properties. There are over 100 predefined reports, but some of them are deprecated. Again, it's a 10-year-old platform. So, there have been a lot of changes over that time. And there are a lot of reports in Universal Analytics that don't give you useful information any longer. Additionally, there are 4 predefined goals. So you have all different ways to kind of track whether your website's being successful as you've got those goals configured. So GA4 is very different. So they don't have page views and stuff as its core thing. Instead, everything is an event, which as you can see above in Universal Analytics, you had page views and you had custom events as were like everything else. It's not a page view. GA4 has the ability to collect app and website data in a single property, which is kind of nice if you want to track a user moving between your app and your web properties. On the other hand, it's got a very small number of predefined reports with maybe more focus on custom reporting or using another data analysis tool. And goals are only mapped to specific event conversions. So that's a 1-to-1 ratio. So we'll talk about each of these in a little bit of detail. So kind of comparing that core model, And I think it's helpful to kind of think about the history of Google Analytics, sort of where it came from, to understand where Universal Analytics is and where Google Analytics 4 is trying to go to. So again, Universal Analytics is really an evolution of like a over 20-year-old platform, right? Merchant on Demand, I think, was first released in 1998. So the web was a very different place when this technology was developed. A lot of the main kind of monetization model was ad placement. And for those of us that have a bit of gray hair, you would have a lot of sites had ads. And so really at its core, Universal Analytics is trying to track how many times pages are viewed and how long people stay on sites, right? That's kind of the goal. So, you've got, like, if you think about Google Universal Analytics, a lot of it is like, okay, how many page views? What's our average session? What's the average number of pages that have been viewed? What's the bounce rate? So like, did someone land on the site and then immediately leave without viewing more pages? Like, that's what it's really kind of keyed to. And so there are a lot of pieces that are just not tracked out of the box by Universal Analytics. So for example, downloading files, submitting a web form. None of that is tracked by Universal Analytics without some additional code, namely custom events. And so that's really kind of the model that Universal Analytics is there to serve. Google Analytics 4, on the other hand, is, you could argue, a more modern way of measuring the success of a website. So, you basically, everything is an event, and there are a lot of different events. We'll talk about a few of them. A lot more stuff is tracked out of the box, a lot of things you would want to track. One of the things that is interesting is Google Analytics 4 doesn't use third-party cookies at all, just Google's first-party cookies. And they also claim to have some support for cookieless tracking using machine learning. So, I mean, it's kind of up to you to determine whether you think that's creepy or not, but that's what they claim to be something that's happening. And then all of the events are very flexible. They can be extended. New events can be made. And in Universal Analytics, custom events were kind of off to the side. Events and making custom events or extending events is really central to how Google Analytics 4 tracks. So it's a very different model. And that's why you've got kind of this not one-to-one relationship, is just like they're effectively measuring different things. So I think it's kind of instructive to kind of think about the key metrics in Universal Analytics versus the key metrics in Google Analytics 4 to kind of say, okay, what's being tracked here and why? So some of the big metrics in Universal Analytics, and if you've been around the web for a while, you definitely will have heard people thinking in these terms, is bounce rates. So that's the percentage of visitors to a website who navigate away from the site after only viewing one page. And normally, a lot of folks think of bounce rate, if you have a high bounce rate, that's a bad thing. But that's really not a very nuanced view. So for example, if your website is providing resources and someone in a search engine types in a search word and your website comes up and they land on that page and then they download from that page the resource that they are looking for and they go about their day because they have gotten what they want, that's going to show up as a bounce in a default Universal Analytics configuration. But your website was successful, right? So it's not a bad outcome. It's just not baked into the core of Universal Analytics. Another example is if you have a web form on your site, someone lands on the web form page and they submit the web form and the web form does not result in a page reload. The default Universal Analytics tracking will not pick that up and it will say it's a bounce, even though the web form was completed and someone ostensibly did what you would like them to do. So bounce rate is really, it doesn't have a lot of nuance. And, you know, but if you look at it, every single report on, or just about every report in Universal Analytics has bounce rate. So people are like, I need to lower my bounce rate. Not really. I mean, it's sort of, it might be useful, but a lot of times it's not very useful. Another big metric is pages per session. So average number of pages a user views in a single session. You know, underlying this is the assumption that more page views is good. But more page views can indicate someone is having trouble finding something. So you'd say, well, maybe that's not so good. So if you've got good information architecture, people might be able to find something very easily. So again, pages per session, not a lot of nuance there. Average session duration, same sort of thing. Average amount of time spent per session. Doesn't include bounces, since those have 0 time spent in those sessions, and that's just due to the technology of Universal Analytics. If there's not a second page view, it has no way of determining how long someone has spent on the site by default. So all of these are kind of that older model of how to measure whether a site's being effective or not. With the kind of thing is more page views, longer sessions, that means good. Google Analytics 4 has a very different approach. So again, everything's events. So out of the box, you have events for file download, offsite link clicks, scrolling, embedded YouTube video tracking, all these sorts of things that are not just page views. Now, page views are also an event, so that gets tracked as well, but it's very different. So the kind of the key metrics in Google Analytics 4 are engaged sessions, average engagement time per session, and engagement rate. So an engaged session is a session that lasts longer than 10 seconds, or had a conversion event, or had 2 or more screen or page views. So now we've got a little more nuance. It's sort of a amalgam of different things, but they are all things that we might think of as this indicated someone engaged with the website. You know, particularly the conversion event. So if someone just gets on the site, downloads a file, this counts. If they spend time scrolling on a page, that's an event. That would get counted as well. So another, and then you kind of go down the list, average engagement time per session. So that's user engagement during duration per session. So in other words, the amount of time a user is actually engaging with the page, clicking, scrolling, etc., while the page is in the primary window being viewed on the screen. So again, this is more of a real measure of, is someone engaging with the website and the content there. And then the engagement rate is a ratio of engaged sessions relative to total sessions. So if you have 1,000 total sessions, 130 of them are qualified as engaged sessions, you get a 13% engagement rate. So, you know, these are the sort of metrics that are kind of baked in to GA4 and kind of provide that, you know, sort of, this is what GA4 is trying to track. So it's a very different beast than Universal Analytics. And it's really focused around these events as signals for engagement rather than page views and session length as signals for engagement. So events, talk a little bit about that. So in Universal Analytics, events were allowed for tracking of other user interactions. They need to be configured either directly in JavaScript or some, depending on your system, might have some modules or plugins or what have you that would allow that. Or you could leverage Google Tag Manager to configure events. Basically had 4 properties, and there's like 3 strings and a number. And you could configure these to be tracked sort of whatever you'd like. Very frequently, in my experience, someone would use like a plugin or a module that would provide some events out of the box, and they'd already have kind of the event category, the event action configured, and they were configured, to my mind, in a way that was leaving a lot of useful information on the table. So you might have like file downloads. So the event category of the event might be a file download, and the event action might be a click, which, I mean, that's accurate, but that's pretty useless information for your analytics, right? We don't really care that someone clicked to download a file. We care about they download a file. What file was it? What page did they download it from? Things of that nature. So you could customize that, but a lot of times if you'd end up using a plugin or a module, these properties would already be set, and they could be set to something that's not very useful. Events in Google Analytics 4, again, a lot of stuff comes out of the box. So things that you used to have to configure, like file downloads, scrolling, video start, video progress, that's already configured. And then you can update or modify all of these built-in events just in Google Analytics 4. Additionally, Google provides recommended events, which are effectively blueprints for common events that are not pre-configured. They say, here's how to set this up. Here's how you should name it. Here is the different parameters that you could add. And then you could make your own custom events that can be configured with the desired parameters. So there's a lot of flexibility just kind of baked in. And again, rather than events being kind of off to the side, they're central to GA4. So reporting. Universal Analytics, huge number of reports, but a lot of them aren't very useful. And then again, most of the best known reports, they're all tuned for page views, bounces, etc. But you could do custom report creation, a little clunky. And then you could do reporting via Google Data Studio, but most folks just install Google Analytics and kind of go about their business. So again, you're ending up using these off-the-shelf reports, which we just covered a lot of issues with. GA4, less than 20 predefined reports. But all the reporting is focused on engagement and which events are engaging users. And I think, just as a user behavior sort of thing, fewer reports make the custom reporting more likely to be used. And then it also supports reporting via Google Data Studio. So you get all the same abilities to customize, but I think since it's more forward and there's kind of less noise in the reports, people are more likely to actually customize and get the information they need. So last big comparison is goals and conversions. So goals and conversions in Universal Analytics, there are 4 types of goals. And so a goal is a way you identify an important user interaction with the website. And there were basically 4 patterns. One was a destination, which is basically say, I count it as a successful conversion. I've achieved a goal if a particular URL loads. And then I could also define like steps, like specific URLs I expect people to go through to get to this URL. So that's a destination goal. Then another type of goal is duration. So session lasted over a minute. Session lasted over 2 minutes. Pages or screens per session. A user viewed more than 2 pages in their session. Count that as a goal, success. Or events. A specific event was triggered. So, again, the duration, pages or screens per session, maybe those aren't the best goals these days, but the destination goal could be pretty useful. And events, are a nice way to track where events are. And, goals are useful for like segmentation. If you want to say like, hey, I want to see, I want to create a segment of like everyone that submit a contact form. And then I want to see, where does that traffic come from? Or what pages do they view? I can use goals for segmentation. So it's pretty helpful. Goals and conversions in Google Analytics 4. Basically, conversions directly replace goals. There are no goals per se, they're just conversions. Any event, including built-in events, can be marked as conversions. But Google Analytics 4 doesn't include any built-in mechanism for destination or funnel-based conversions. So, that was actually one of the things that when Google Analytics 4 came out, there were a few pieces that people were kind of chatting about. Maybe it's not ready for prime time, but it looks like that this is basically an intentional design decision on Google's part that they don't think that's relevant. And again, it's a free tool. So if folks don't like it, they can use something else. I'm going to pause for a second to see if anyone had any questions there before we get into GDPR and privacy considerations. And I'm also going to take a drink of water.
It might be better to ask later after you finish, but I'm just curious if it differentiates between session duration on mobile and desktop. If the difference in scroll, the difference in travel is accounted for.
I think you can definitely see, I think you can segment by device.
Okay.
And so you could definitely look at that. But I don't think that there's anything native in the scroll event that would say it's one or the other, but I think you could do it with segmentation.
Okay.
All right, so GDPR and privacy considerations. So what's the GDPR? General Data Protection Regulation. I got it right. Awesome. So it's an EU law on data protection and privacy in the EU and the European Economic Area. Guarantees EU citizens protection of personal data, and that includes their name, their location, their IP address, their cookie information, and some other stuff. So basically, unlike what we've got in the US, the GDPR provides EU citizens with several rights to their personal data, including right to access it, right to rectify it, erase it, restricting its processing, moving it, portability, and the right to object to any other stuff, in addition to rights related to automatic decision-making around profiling. And so the GDPR applies to any organization operating in the EU, as well as those outside the EU that offer goods or services to users in the EU. And then the real rub here, and this is why it's important, is GDPR requirements apply not only to any website that an organization has, but also any service the website uses that could get any of the protected personal data, such as Google Analytics. So a lot to unpack there. I'm not a lawyer, not going to unpack it all. Does the GDPR apply to your organization? Ask your legal counsel. But if it does, then there's some considerations about whether you should use Google Analytics at all. Universal Analytics, again, it's over 10 years old. Personally identifiable information such as names and IP addresses is not provided to website owners. And then you're also, by the Google's terms of service, forbidden from tracking PII using Universal Analytics events. So from that perspective, it's kind of okay, but Universal Analytics does collect IP addresses and data from third-party cookies. This information is used to, quote, measure the effectiveness of advertising and improve the effectiveness of Google products. Doesn't sound evil at all. Additionally, the data is stored on Google servers located in the US. So this is relevant because in the first half of 2020, France, Italy, Austria, and Denmark, their kind of country level enforcement arms all determined that Universal Analytics does not comply with GDPR. So based on that decision, websites that are subject to the GDPR should cease using Universal Analytics, but again, consult your legal counsel. The core concern is that just a little bit of background. So there's a possibility for if I in my website am going to take user data and then I'm going to process it. There's a way that with the little cookie pop-ups like, yes, we're going to use data. Okay. That there's a way that people could consent. But the core issue that was raised was that if this data is collected, including IP addresses, and is stored on US servers, the US government could, using a warrant, go to a US data center and say, hey, Google, unhash this, give us this information. Here's a warrant. And the EU person whose data was unhashed has no way to consent to the US government doing this and has no way of fighting this. So because of that, that's why France, Italy, Austria, and Denmark said universal analytics is not does not meet GDPR compliance. Now, as of June 2022, no one's been fined, which, you know, I cannot imagine the amount of red tape that would be required for actually issuing fines to all of the websites that are using universal analytics. Like, that's staggering number of sites. But if you need to be in compliance with GDPR, you should not use universal analytics. So situation's better for Google Analytics 4, right? That's an open question. GA4 includes several improvements for privacy, including, GA4 initially uses IP to determine where a user's data, GA initially uses IPs to decide where to store a user's data. So you can actually store data in the EU or in the US. And you can also, based on the IP, set country level controls and customization to minimize the collection of specific user data. A concern about that is, while the IPs are used for where the user's data is stored, the IP processing is still done on a US server. So it's a question of whether that's sufficient or not. The EU and its country level enforcement agencies have not made any official decisions regarding GA4. Most of the commentators that are writing about this believe that GA4 doesn't sufficiently address concerns about US government spying. But most of those commentators that have written about this also offer competing analytics products. So, I mean, maybe they probably have a point, but they're also pretty self-interested. So, TBD whether GA4 will be better. Now, to address this, the US and the EU have announced a new framework for transatlantic data flow with an improved data protection plan. Formal language hasn't been finalized, so it's too early to say whether it will be deemed adequate. Basically, the way that this tends to work is there are some privacy-focused NGOs in the EU, and when the language is finalized, if they don't like it, they'll sue, and depending on how the EU courts that they sue in rule, that's sort of how the decisions will go from there. So that is GA4 status. Alternatives. There are several alternatives out there. Recently, I was looking at these for a client. The four that I think we're considering investigating more are Matomo. I don't know how to pronounce the second one. Puki Pro or whatever. Plausible and Fathom. Matomo and Puki Pro are, I believe, one is a paid SaaS fork of the other, which is open source and you can self-host. And Plausible and Fathom are their own things. It's kind of a contrast to the earlier point about Google. If you're not the customer, you're the product. These all have a monthly fee or yearly fee based on usage. And they also don't collect PII, and the data is housed in the EU. So they are much more likely to be and remain in compliance with the GDPR. The yearly fee is super modest for most websites, like $10 a month. So that's they're reasonable alternatives. And the big thing, this is something I added over the slides that Sean saw last time, is they have or soon expect to have importers to import historic universal analytics data. So even if you decide to go to Google Analytics 4, if you want to retain your historical data, for something nominal like $10 a month, you could import that and do that. Or you could set up a self-hosted instance and just have access to your older data. You could run them in parallel. There are a lot of things you could do that are pretty nice. None of these look as full-featured as Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, or GA4. Most of them have, again, sort of the older Universal Analytics model. So they're more along the page views, bounce rate line of thinking, though they do all support custom events. Some of them have sort of an equivalent to Google Tag Manager, just not as mature and robust. But a lot of them, if you want custom events, you're going to be writing JavaScript. So depending on the particulars of an organization and their website, that may or may not be a deal breaker for you, but there are alternatives out there. So again, I will pause because I knew I threw a lot of legal stuff at you. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to get another sip of water before we talk about how, why, when, and how.
I'm a little curious about the GDPR stuff in terms of like, hey, if I through Google Analytics on a US website intended for a US audience, which is, and the people visiting it never log in and never give you any information. I mean, it doesn't seem like you have much.
Yeah, I would
much
say
reason
that
to worry, right?
my understanding is you don't have a lot of exposure there. Like now, if you were selling something to the EU or trying to do business with someone in the EU, you'd have a lot more exposure from my understanding. But, if you're not doing business in the EU, then, if someone drives by, my understanding is you're pretty limited in your exposure there. But again, consult your EU lawyer.
Sure.
There's a service that we use called IUBenda that basically they're a compliance company, so they have EU lawyers on staff and web developers on staff, and so they provide a lot of commentary on GDPR developments, as well as solutions for consent and things of that nature. So I'd encourage you to take a look at them if you think GDPR may apply to you, because it's, they're a pretty reasonable resource, pretty inexpensive, and they're actually experts in the legal aspect of it.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Maybe you
Go
could put a note about what that company was.
Yeah, it looks like Sean dropped that in the chat.
Or Sean already dropped.
Yes.
Okay.
So one question I had was like, so you talked about GDPR a bunch. The California has its own protection thing too?
Yeah, so the California one is really if you are intending on selling or distributing user data.
Okay.
And it's specific to that. It doesn't have the sort of right to be forgotten and stuff like that that's kind of baked into the GDPR, because we in the US don't have a lot of rights related to our data. I mean, I think it's just one of these things that just kind of culturally we don't expect that. And so it seems on a little ways a little bit wild, the extent of the GDPR and what is protected there. As a little bit of an aside, I think that the GDPR would have made a lot more sense if it were put into place 20 years ago, before, when the internet was at a much earlier stage, where the internet could have developed in a way that actually was aligned with the GDPR. And then we'd be in a very different place. But that ship has sailed, so we'll see if the EU can steer the internet towards what they want. All right, well, let's go through implementing Google Analytics 4. So, I wouldn't say that this talk is a wholehearted endorsement of GA4 or Google Analytics generally. I'd like to think it's a little bit more nuanced. So I figured it would be useful to sort of talk about, should you implement GA4 at all? So questions that I like to think about is, one, are you currently using Universal Analytics? So if so, since that's on a time clock, you should definitely begin moving off of Universal Analytics in the near term, or getting some sort of parallel tracking situation in place so that you'll have continuity of data and actually be able to do historical analysis once Google shuts off new tracking for Universal Analytics. Another data point is, are you using other Google products? Like if you're using GTM, Google Data Studio, then GA4 plays well with those. You get a lot of benefits for staying in the Google ecosystem. Is your organization subject to GDPR? Well, then you should stop using UA immediately. But you have to kind of think about whether GA4, whether you want to take the risk of putting that out there, as its sort of status is still TBD. So you got to make your own decision. But those are kind of the questions that I talk through with our clients relative to GA4. When should you implement it? If you regularly use Universal Analytics, if you regularly review Universal Analytics data, and that includes kind of historic reporting on that data to make decisions, then I think you need to get something in place ASAP so that you'll have historic data in the new platform that you can actually have, apples to apples comparisons. Because, if you implement, GA4 or another analytics solution on June 30, 2023, you're going to have a hard time making business decisions until you have whatever historical periods you need in the new analytics platform. So, the sooner the better, basically. If you have custom events currently tracked in Universal Analytics, you'll need to re-implement those in GA4 or whatever other platform. So you want to make sure you've got those in place. Now, some of the stuff might already be covered with out of the box, but some stuff like form tracking is not out of the box. So you need to make sure you configure that. Does your organization use Google Data Studio dashboards or other thing that consumes UA stuff? Well, then you need to make sure you've got time to adjust those. The adjustment process is not crazy, but it does take a little bit of time, and it's nice to have some data to work with when you're making those adjustments. And then the other thing, and this is maybe a little philosophically, kind of ties into kind of my firm's philosophy. If you're undertaking a significant website redesign soon, I'd recommend actually implementing your new analytics platform now, so that you've got a baseline of the old site in the new platform. So when the new site launches, you can see how things shift, and again, have an apples to apples comparison in the platform you're going to be on going forward. So if that's GA4 or Matomo or whatever, that's, I think, kind of the critical piece there, is to have that in place. So how should you implement it? Like basically, one way is just the same way you've done Universal Analytics. It is, again, just JavaScript. There are different ways to do that. You could put it directly in the theme. You can implement it using a plugin or a module, or use Google Tag Manager. So it might be appropriate to do it in the same way. But I think there's another piece to that that's something to consider. Who's responsible for maintaining or updating your analytics, and like what's their technical comfort level? So developers might be comfortable adding or updating JavaScript like in theme code per se, or template files or wherever. But if you've got a marketing or communications team and they really own Google Analytics, even if you've got it currently implemented in your theme or with a plugin, it might make sense to move it over to something like Google Tag Manager, so that it's a not as obviously a code-based solution, and they're able to kind of more self-serve. So that's I think something to consider. Since you've got to do this transition, might as well do it in a better way, if there is a better way to be done. So implementation steps. You're gonna create your GA4 property, configure filtering for internal traffic, which is different than Universal Analytics, add the tracking code to your website, and then configure events, reports, and conversions. So creating the GA4 property, pretty easy. If you have an existing UA property, use the GA4 setup assistant, or you can hit the create property button, which defaults to a GA4 property. Enter the name, fill out your organizational details if you want to. And again, since GA4 properties support multiple data sources, you'll need to configure a data stream. Setup assistant will run you through that, or you can skip that and just click on the data stream thing, set it up there. And then you can adjust the events that are provided, but most folks just leave that as a default. And then you get access to your stream ID. And this is the tracking ID that you want, not the old Universal Analytics ID, and ability to download tracking code. So I've got some screenshots. See the big blue button, create property, or the GA4 setup assistant. Both of those work well. Put your property name in. You can put this stuff in if you want to give Google some info. You hit create. And now you want to set up a data stream. It's under data streams there. And you want to add a stream for the web. Put your website URL in there, stream name, and you could turn off the enhanced measurement that gives you those out of the box events, but I would say leave it on unless you have a reason not to. Then you create the stream. The stream gives you the ability to get tracking codes. That's actually a little further down. I cut that off to fit on the slide, but your measurement ID is up there. And if you're using like a module or a plugin, generally just going to want your measurement ID code to drop that in there. Filtering for internal traffic. This is different. So the way that that you would handle things for Universal Analytics is you basically would set up a raw profile or a raw property and a filtered property. And you'd have a filter on each of those so that your raw would just be all of your analytics data, and the filtered would basically filter out like your internal IP addresses or what have you. There's not a concept of having these different like views and stuff set up for GA4. And this is like the other thing that folks are like, this is half baked. We need these. Google's like, whatever. So basically instead, you need to configure internal traffic, and it tracks it as a segment, and you can basically then turn that on and off, which allows you to, like if your web developers on your internal network and you want to test something, you can then turn off filtering of traffic and then turn it back on. Or I think they might have just changed it. You were able to leave it in testing mode and then you could just segment it out, but it looks like they changed that when I was updating the slides today. I haven't had a full investigation there. Got a few screenshots. So basically from your data stream, you go to configure tag settings. This took me a little while because they moved this in the 2 months since I did the slides last. Configure tag settings, show all, very important. And then you can define internal traffic, and then you can add your rule name and set your IP ranges. And then to manage that, you go back to data settings, data filters, and then you can activate or deactivate individual filters. Kind of a pain. Adding the tracking code is basically 3-ish options. One is you can just drop the provided site tags as instructed in HTML or theme code. 2, if you're using Drupal or WordPress, there are plenty of plugins or module options and you just drop your appropriate data stream ID in there. Or Google Tag Manager, you can add the container directly to HTML or theme code as instructed, or you could use a module or plugin for those. They exist. Kind of whatever you do, you want to make sure that you're including the Google Analytics tracking code only on desired pages and user roles. Most of the modules or plugins provide some functionality for you to do that. I know the Drupal we commonly use Google Tag Manager. So the Google Tag Manager module has some ability to include or exclude on certain user roles, certain paths, certain content types. So you got a lot of flexibility to get that configured. You don't want to just be like, hey, I'm going to shove it onto on every page of my site and then get tracking your your admin usage, right? That would be weird. Configuring events, reports, and conversions. Once you've got everything tracking and stuff, you can add additional events. You can either implement them in JavaScript directly, or, and this is what I'd recommend, Google Tag Manager. If you have played with Google Tag Manager before, they have a really handy add a tag for a Google Analytics 4 event. And then you can just define your properties with just adding properties and then hooking up to Google Tag Manager variables. A lot of the plugins also provide some event tracking that's added in there. Reports can be in Google Analytics 4, or you can use Google Analytics 4 as a data source for Google Data Studio. I forgot to get screenshots of this, but conversion events, basically, you can either, it's kind of nice. You basically can just go into Google Analytics 4 and say, I want to identify events as conversions. Say this type of event, that's a conversion. And then you'll be able to segment track on that. So now you are ready to track data and measure performance with GA4, if you want to. You can implement GA4 in parallel with Universal Analytics. It's kind of neat in that since they're different tracking codes, they don't interfere with each other. If you were to implement two Universal Analytics tracking codes at once, you would get weird results. Don't do that. But GA4 and Universal Analytics will play nice together in parallel. I'm recommending folks do 3 to 6 months before they turn off Universal Analytics unless they've got GDPR stuff. And then once you've got your historic data in place, you can sunset UA, hopefully well ahead of July 1, 2023. So GA4, big improvement over Universal Analytics. If you wish to use Google Analytics, you should move to GA4 ASAP. If you have GDPR requirements, stay tuned or select an on Google Analytics solution. So questions?
Thanks so much, Stephen. Super helpful in this weird limbo state that we're in with Google Analytics. So one question I had while we wait to see if anybody else wants to chime in, chat, or unmuting, is with regards to like Tag Manager, right? So let's say my client has a bunch of stuff in Tag Manager as events. They're all tracked right now as Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, right? So it's basically recreate that entire thing. There's no easy or like make a copy of this and change the thing. It doesn't seem like that.
there isn't like a magic button there. I will say in the clients that we've transitioned, the only thing I've had to recreate is either really client specific stuff or form tracking. Like most of what I would do would be like file download tracking, offsite link clicks, things of that nature, scroll depth tracking, setting up the YouTube tracking, all of that stuff. That's just tracked out of the box. And so that's all pretty straightforward. The weird thing is with the recommended events, they don't actually have a recommended event that is specifically for form submission. They have one for, was it lead generation, maybe? I think. And then they don't have, it's not like the things you'd think about for like, where on my website did this happen? It's more like assign a value to this lead. But all of the events can be extended in Google Analytics 4 by just going, hey, modify this event. And I want to change these properties. And then you're good to go.
Cool, thanks.
I was sort of interested in the bit you talked about segmenting quote unquote internal traffic.
Mhm.
Do they only support IP ranges for that? That seems, you know, a little not useful for organizations where everyone works from home or otherwise, you know, does not necessarily have a identifiable IP or, you know,
Mhm.
today I'm working from co-working space and tomorrow from the coffee shop and whatever, and, you know, tomorrow from Aruba because I'm, you know, working on from the beach, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
but I still wouldn't necessarily want my traffic counted. I mean, is there a way to like, you know, it seems pretty annoying if everyone had to like set their own cookie
Mhm.
or something. I mean, obviously you could do that, but is there a recommended way to do that?
So I think that I don't remember off the top of my head whether there are many other knobs to turn. I don't remember there being a lot of other knobs on the internal traffic filter. The way I would approach that, and the way I think that is normally the case, is most of the time, folks whose traffic you want to not track might be like a developer or a marketing team or someone who's working on a site, and they're almost always logged into the site, working on the site, right?
Sure.
And so if you've got your analytics code configured so it just isn't fired when, you know, you're logged in, then that's a non-issue.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that's an easy solution for that part of it. Yeah, so,
Yeah.
okay, that's a good suggestion. I don't know if like the pre-built solutions handle that. I mean, clearly not if you just like shove it in a block and
Yeah,
put out
I would
HTML,
say
but
most
yeah.
of them do through one way or the other. Like, I mean, if you're putting it in like a WordPress site, you put it on like the non-admin template, the public template, then
Yeah.
that mostly covers that. I think Monster Insights, which is one of the common WordPress plugins, does not track if you're logged in. I know the Drupal ones provide a lot of granular control in a very Drupal-y way. But it's kind of nice because you can kind of say, okay, like right now we're working on a site that's effectively this kind of complex members only thing. And so we've got like some specialized admin roles, and then we've got a bunch of authenticated users who we want to track. And we're able to kind of, you know, easily, granularly say, yes, these user roles track, these user roles do not track. And that's all on the Drupal side.
So I'll ask another question. So with UA eventually going away in the way that Google put things in their graveyard, you know, what you mentioned that these other tools were potentially going to have some way of ingesting or getting this data out. And I think you can dump like CSVs from
You can do
Google
that too, yeah.
Analytics. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, what would your plan be to like archive this? Because obviously you could dump it into like Tableau, or you could dump it into some other like visualization or like, platform like that. Like, but like, what's the, what would your go-to be if, is it just client dependent?
So I think it's a little bit client dependent, and I can walk you through kind of my thoughts on how I'd kind of navigate that for a client. So if someone is if they want to get away from Google and they want to use one of the non-Google solutions, then I would just implement the non-Google solution. Use the importer, because I think 3 of the 4 already have something out there. One of them is still in development as of when I checked today, but just import it. It's a pretty straightforward process. You've got to set up a Google OAuth thing, but most of them have like, here's a video to walk you through it. So it's not particularly onerous. And then I would just kind of go with that. There is some differences in the data, so it's better to take that pain now rather than later, and just get onto the new platform as soon as possible. So I would do, like, if I was going off of Google Analytics 4, that's what I do. The next big question is like, how much historic reporting do you need, right? I think that I can't think of the last time that, with very few exceptions, there was ever a day-to-day need to look more than a year in the past, right? Because we're mostly looking for trends from year over year or quarter over quarter. So I would consider being like, okay, well, so long as we've got like a year's worth of data in GA4, it's probably fine. You know, we're going to lose that data, but when's the last time someone looked at it? You know, you could save out CSV so you've just got it in case you need it. But I think as a practical matter, very few people are going to look at it. But in the case of where someone is, like if someone's actually consulting it, or you have like a regulatory reason to do so, then I think it makes sense to actually pay the, you know, you could shove it in Tableau, or you could, I think it was the PivKey Pro. It's a self-hosted option. You could set that up and ingest it that way. Or just pay the $10 a month, because again, it's a pretty negligible fee, all things considered, to just ingest it. And then you could even run parallel tracking GA4 and the other system because you're paying for it, and see maybe their project gets more mature or whatever. But it's not that much extra JavaScript. Most of them are a lot more lightweight than GA4 as well. So you're not even really going to have much effect on like your, you know, core web vitals. That's the Google sets of words for page speed.
Awesome, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions or things they want to ask?
It's probably built into the functionality, but I'm assuming that this plays nice with Google Ads, the same way that Universal does, or are there any weird hiccups or things that we should take note of in terms of like ads or AdWords?
I have not run across any. We don't do a whole lot with Google Ads in my agency. I kind of imagine that it'll play as well as anything will with Google Ads. I do think that there's going to be a lot less granularity and visibility of data in GA4 with some of the ditching of third-party cookie ingestion, as well as the potentially having a cookieless future. What they're claiming is that the machine learning thing will allow them to fill in the gaps of their data, which, I don't know, sounds a little bit like, hey, we're just going to tell you it's going to do what it is. It'll be a lot more approximate. But they also have a lot of computing power. So I mean, maybe they can do some stuff. I don't know.
Okay.
So I have a silly question. If I'm looking at a like old website, is there like a version of Google Analytics before Universal Analytics that's still supported? Or is it basically like either it's Universal Analytics now or nothing?
I
If I
think
have
it's
an old
pretty,
site.
I think it's probably, if it's still tracking, it's probably Universal Analytics. I don't know when asynchronous went unsupported, or if it has officially. I can't imagine that if the lights are still on with asynchronous tracking, I can't imagine they will continue to track data after Universal Analytics sunsets.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like an obvious way to tell from the you know,
Yeah,
URLs.
it's a different tracking code. I don't remember off the top of my head what it is, but if you Google asynchronous, like Google Analytics asynchronous and Google Analytics Universal Analytics, it'll tell you what the JavaScript, what JavaScript library it's using.
Okay.
I just don't remember what they are off the top of my head. Not a developer.
Well, and all the UI ones are UI hyphen, right? So that would be a inspect element, find it. And all the new ones are G hyphen, right?
Yep. The one place it's a little bit obscured is if you've implemented it via Google Tag Manager, because again, that's sort of effectively iframed in. Or even not even iframed, it's just obscured. You can't see that in this, or well, I guess if you inspect, you'll see it. A lot of times I'm lazy, I just view source.
I don't have any questions, Stephen. I thought that was a really good presentation. We're kind of in the middle of this now at Princeton, because, you know, we've got like hundreds of websites that we maintain, and they've all, you know, got Google Analytics on them. So most of our users are not very technical. They don't understand or utilize what the full capabilities of Google Analytics give you. And considering that Google Analytics or Universal Analytics does not migrate into the Google Analytics 4 data, like you're going to basically lose all your data anyway, that where we were starting to look into the simple alternatives to see if, you know, rather than tell all of our users like, hey, you've got to follow these steps to like create a Google Analytics 4 property, we're going to give them that option, but also we're potentially looking to like pay one of these simple analytics companies for a much simpler alternative. Because I think like 90% or more of our users, if they care about analytics at all, they care about the very basic statistics, like how many, and using like the traditional model, like you mentioned in Universal Analytics, where they're talking about like page views. Because we're talking about like traditional websites here, where every, you know, link on a page loads the page again. It's not like a progressive web or it's not a single page application in JavaScript, or where there's like kind of a blurred definition of what a page is, you know. So yeah, I mean, I spoke to both Fathom and Simple Analytics last week or 2 weeks ago. Fathom, Simple Analytics, and Plausible, they're all very small companies that are not based in the US. They're all super highly privacy focused and all compatible with GDPR, so you don't have to display a cookie banner for the sites that would have to comply with such a thing. But they're all very small companies. You know, I think like Simple Analytics and Fathom, it's like 2 people. But they're growing. I mean, they both said that they're just basically been exploding in growth because of all of these European regulations and you know, countries within the EU coming out with these laws and whatnot, are knocking down Google for one reason or another. So they're getting a lot more business from that, which is nice. And it's nice that, yeah, go ahead.
The other one I would say is Matomo looks pretty mature as well.
But yeah, but it's basically as complicated, or it could be as complicated as Google, right? Is that my understanding? Yeah.
I mean, I would say it is the most mature of them. But for your use case, Plausible or Fathom, I think I looked at Simple, and I don't remember why I discounted them for the client I was looking for. It might have been they didn't have as robust event support or something like that.
Yeah, they're probably the simplest of them with the appropriate name. They don't even track IP addresses at all. So their calculation for what a unique page view is based on the referral header. So it's like if your referral header indicates that you came from the website that, you know, you're already on, they assume that you're the same visitor. But it's not as accurate as these other 2, which use IP address, but they delete the IP data after 1 day. So their tracking of unique page views is really just uniques per 1 day, because there's no cookies. None of those 3 companies I mentioned use cookies at all. So it's probably not as accurate as Google, but in the same regard, you don't know like how many people are like blocking Google Analytics too. Especially because Google's like the biggest one. I think I saw recently that like 85% of sites have Google trackers on them. It's insane. It's crazy. So, you know, a lot of ad blockers and stuff are starting to block that stuff. And so one benefit of these other companies I've been reading is, I know at least one of them, you can use like a custom domain. So it basically proxies through like a different service or a different domain, so that ad blockers wouldn't know like, oh, this is the domain you should be blocking, because it's your own custom domain to track the data. But,
another nice thing with all of those companies is you have the right to delete your data.
Right.
And so, you know, you actually own it. Unlike like Google, where it's like,
you're so right. Yeah. I mean, it's so easy they make it so easy to install and use, because, you know, they're harvesting the data of like what website you're tracking and visiting, you know. So But we'll see how it goes. I mean, and web accessibility is big here at Princeton, and like none of these dashboards I looked at from these small companies are like super accessible with a screen reader or anything, which is a problem for us. But they're also small enough where they'd probably be willing to like make changes if we ask them to, unlike Google, who are like, we're just a tiny fish in the pond. So
Yeah, I think I'm hoping to be able to give this talk over at some of the universities around our area, because I think they are not as far ahead on the research as you are.
yeah, we're just getting a little nervous that it's like crazy to me that Google's just like shutting it down in 10 months from now, I think. So yeah, I saw that in one article, like Google has documentation on how to like migrate to GA4, and it's like a potential 12-step process, depending on how much or what feature set you use of Google Analytics. Like if you're using like the commerce event tracking and stuff, it's wild, like how much stuff you would potentially have to do manually. And then asking like hundreds of our website owners to like think to do that when half of them are like barely technical people that are wearing like 20 different hats in their department. So
Yeah, for us, a lot of our nonprofit clients, we have Google Analytics there because they had no tracking, so they had no idea what anybody was doing, several years ago. And so like they have a very basic setup. So like turning on GA4 will probably make their life better because they'll know how many downloads it was without, having something custom set up. But then, we do have the bigger ones where there's more customization, and it's just like they're trying to figure all that out and get those people up to date, because the interface is so different, right? Like not only is Google just shutting this thing down in 10 months, it's like also like, oh, here's a completely different product, and we don't call things the same things 100%. And I was on a call this week and they're like, what do you mean they got rid of bounce rate? It's like, well, they got rid of bounce rate. You have no choice but to accept this feature. Thanks, Lance, for the various things that Google has killed over time. If there's not any other questions for Stephen or about this, maybe we'll just open it up to see if anybody has something they want to share or ask about. We have about half hour left. Stephen, thanks again for joining us tonight and presenting on this. And we'll let you know how life is going.
All right. Well, I think I will call it a night. Thank you all for the time. I'm going to go get some supper.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
All right. So if anybody has a question they want to ask, feel free to just open up the line, chat, whatever you feel comfortable doing.
I don't have a question per se, but there's another online conference that I'm probably going to attend in September. It's not really Drupal related, but it takes place in Animal Crossing, which is a video game. So I was going to post that link in case anybody's curious about it. It's a DevOps conference that's 2 days in the middle of September.
Awesome. Yeah. Did they do that last year? I feel like I definitely saw like an Animal Crossing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't attend it last year. I didn't hear about it until earlier this year. I think it was just 1 day last year, but it's 2 days this year. It's a deserted island is the moniker for I don't know what their island is actually called. I don't have the game, but you can attend on Twitch or Discord as well.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lance, we'll put it up on YouTube. All things Google. Besides Zoom.
Peter, are you a Vue.js pro yet?
I wouldn't say pro. I would say if usually I start from something that works and make something else that works.
Isn't it fun to use? Don't you enjoy it?
Yes, for the most part. I mean, it's when you first look at it, like it's a little confusing, but it works pretty well. And yeah, I mean, it's far better than doing raw JavaScript. That's for sure.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I mean, especially like the single page, like the whatever you call them, the combined page
Single
format where you
page.
have like the
Yeah. Single file components.
single file components. Yeah, I mean, that makes it like a lot nicer to work with if you need, especially, I mean, we at least for the moment aren't putting too much CSS there, but at least you have the
Mhm.
template and you have the code that works with the template and boom, like it's easy to understand what's happening versus
Yeah,
like normal JavaScript. You're like, what the hell is HTML is this running against?
yeah.
So,
It's tough
Um,
to commit to a JavaScript framework,
mm,
because everything's evolving and changing so rapidly. Like, I know I was talking to Tim Plunkett at DrupalCamp, and he said that his team in Acquia, they're using Svelte
Hmm.
for some UI stuff. I think the project browser work they're doing for Drupal.
Oh, I
And
didn't realize
I
that.
looked into that, and it's apparently like super fast and like just as easy to use as Vue.
Hmm.
But to me, it's like I hadn't even heard of it up till that point.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, yet another JavaScript framework. That's like the hot new thing,
Right. I mean, that's sort of what, I hate about the JavaScript stuff, though. It'll be interesting to see with, so I guess Wikimedia committed to using Vue.js in some way, right? I don't know if they even just decided Vue 3 or Vue 2,
Hmm.
but that's so.
Yeah,
I
the
feel like
more, yeah,
if there's like a bunch of institutional commitment to it, it might, it might be like Drupal, right? It's like, hey, I want something that is robust and full featured and works, even if it's not the most fast or sexy thing on the internet.
right.
I don't
It's
know.
just I think Vue is a little easier, probably a lot easier to pick up than React. React is by far still the most popular one. I think it's just the steeper learning curve.
Hmm.
And Svelte
Is
and
it
React are like related, right? Like, so Svelte is kind of a replacement for React or a competitor that's more
I don't know.
closely
I don't know
aligned
about
to
that.
it that I know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Of what I know. Syntax is slightly different, stuff like that, but that's
Yeah,
all
I mean,
JavaScript frameworks.
right. I mean, and also for most of what we're doing, I mean, we're doing stuff that is, I mean, unfortunately, somewhat replicating native Drupal UI, but we just want it to be more interactive, right? So it's like
Yeah,
basically tables or maybe some forms. So it's like,
yeah,
we don't need like super fancy like fly-in widgets and all kinds of crap, right? Like, so
right.
I think that's also why we're like, make a listing page and give it some modal pop-ups that do something. Done, Though we have had fun essentially partially re-implementing like the basic Drupal render flow for like forms. And we're actually like pulling the form displays out of the back end and using that to like
Mhm.
render a Vue.js form.
Oh,
Um,
really?
Yeah, because then you like, then you can just be like, hey, go reorder the form display in using field UI, and boom, your
Right.
front end like magically looks like the way you want
Yeah,
it to.
yeah. That's nice.
It's nice, but it's a it's kind of hacky to make it work. And
Right.
we had to write our own REST endpoint that kind of like took the form display and threw extra things in there, like all the allowed values for the fields or things that you don't necessarily get out of the box. It's a
Right.
mess.
Right.
And and access, field access, right? So like this
Mhm.
user has access or doesn't have access to a particular field down on the form,
Right.
right? You want to take account of that because otherwise you submit it and they get a 403.
Right.
So
Wow.
don't recommend it unless you're, in the particularly ugly situation that we are. So
Yeah. Sounds like you're always knee deep in some crazy problem over there.
well, the problem continues to be the same, which is that we have, we still have a lot of our data and front end in the old version
Drupal 7.
of the product. What?
Yeah.
7.
It's
Ha!
based
Ah,
Drupal 6.
nah.
Stop. Get out of here. Drupal 5?
Yeah.
What?
You don't know about this? We're using Drupal
No.
5 to host the headless interface for our Drupal 9 backend.
What?
Oh,
I had no idea.
Peter.
Yeah, holy.
I guess it's just so challenging to get the data out of there.
Yeah,
or,
I mean,
just
you know,
not worth it.
no, I mean, it's going to be eventually, but we have to like rebuild like,
What
you
it
know,
did,
1,000
yeah.
gallons of custom like business
1,000
code.
gallons, yeah.
I mean,
It was
just imagine,
truly whoever built the original thing was truly utilizing Drupal as a framework, is what you're saying.
yeah, well,
So
that
it's
person is
just like
still
a
on staff, and he like every time when they
oh,
look at
okay.
the code, he's like, "Oh, I'm really sorry I did that."
It's just like, yeah, ton of custom code. Yeah, okay.
Right, there's so much custom code and custom hooks and hacks on hacks on hacks.
Oh my goodness.
You know, because it's
Yeah.
like, well, we had to make it, you know, they had to make it work for the first 3 customers or, you know, whoever, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So, you know, and lots of, yeah, it's surprising how much you can do with views 1.
Views 1. I just don't even want to see what the back end interface looks like in Drupal 5. I've never used Drupal 5, but I remember
Oh, you
Drupal
got,
6, and it was just like so archaic. Like the admin theme is just like so dated looking now.
yeah, I mean, 5 and 6 weren't that different. I mean,
Okay.
I forget what the time frame is between 5 and 6, but it was like maybe a year tops.
Okay.
Like the big changes in Drupal 6 to 5 are like a lot of the menu system changes and like some other, you know, which was pretty substantial, but you know, and a few other things that, but it wasn't anywhere near the kind of like overhaul of code that 6 to 7 was, right? 6 to 7 was, I
Right.
think, like, I forget what, a couple years.
Oh, that was
long.
a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah.
Right,
So
and then 7 to 8, I don't even remember what, like 5 years?
5 years. That was ridiculous. 5 was January 2007. 6 was February 2008.
Yeah, so it was a little over a year, so yeah, it was not like a massive amount of
Right.
changes.
And then 7 is
So,
4
you know,
years.
if you
and-
understand how to write Drupal 6 code, you could write the Drupal 5 code for the most part.
Right.
But yeah, it's like you don't have quite as many of the hooks that you're used to, or things are a little uglier, you know.
Right.
So, you know, if you're looking for a job where that's
Oh, where I can work on like a steaming pile of technical debt.
yeah, exactly.
Who wouldn't
And
want that?
we
Yeah.
might have an opening soon for you, Brian.
Oh no, we have our own steaming piles of technical debt here, and we hired someone who he's fully remote. He lives in Chicago, and he basically works on it all day, just cleaning up old code. It's not fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
not fun.
No.
But you know, we
somebody's
are
gotta
actually
do it.
rebuilding it, so it's like
Yeah.
we do get to use the Vue.js stuff, and hopefully the, you know, the advantage of building in Vue.js and doing it this way is that like when we turn on the new site, it will be exactly the same interfaces for some of these things because it will be exactly the same code they were already using.
Mm-hmm.
So hoping for a win there, but we'll see.
Yeah. So you're building these Vue interfaces that are currently talking to the old data or the old.
Well, no.
Drupal 5.
They're simply being rendered in the old site. Then they
Okay, I
use like
gotcha.
JSON API and stuff to talk to the
I
new
see.
site. So every
So you're slowly switching out the old stuff with the new stuff. Yeah.
basically, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Plus trying to
Okay.
make sure that when they write the new features,
Yeah.
mostly in the new site and not in the old site.
Yeah. Wow.
Like stop digging, right? When you're in the hole, stop digging.
Yeah.
So,
Brian, I
yeah.
know you made that like registrar site, right? Where you're using Vue.js. Is that still a thing?
Yeah. Yeah. If you go to registrar.princeton and click on course offerings, that's all Vue.js.
But what is that reading from? That's reading from some other system,
It's-
right?
Yeah, it's reading from we at Princeton we have this API software called WSO2. It's like paid software that we have. It's an expensive license, I think, but it's like enterprise API software. It's written in Java. So it's talking to our api.princeton.edu, which interfaces with like our course data system.
Okay.
It's an Oracle database. So yeah, none of the data for the course offerings goes through Drupal. It's just the interfaces being. In fact, Drupal's not really involved in this at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do stuff like with Vue.js a couple times a year. We'll use it for interfaces. It's usually content listings where like we need to do like advanced filtering and stuff like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I was
Where
gonna
it's
say,
just so
like-
much easier to do than trying to wrangle views to make it work.
Mhm.
Because you're much more limited in views than you are in like, I just wish I could like get this checkbox to do this one thing. It's like, you just have a lot more power with Vue.js. And then if you just create like what we tend to do is we create custom controllers in like simple custom modules that just like query the database directly to get the data that you need. And it's like, I don't know, like 20 lines of code to do that. So it's like, it's such a little amount of work. And then, the Vue.js stuff isn't much code either, because the framework is doing all the heavy lifting of rendering everything for you.
Yeah.
I prefer it to using
Question
views in a lot of
there.
cases.
You're not using REST plugins for that?
I mean, if the data is stored in Drupal, we might.
No. But yeah, we said your custom controllers, so that's what I wasn't.
Yeah, no, I mean, using a custom controller, querying that just has an action that just queries the database and returns it as JSON, to me, is very, very lightweight compared to enabling the REST module or the JSON API module, which is thousands and thousands of lines of code. It's just like, it's less code running to get the data. And if I'm not building, I mean, if it was the whole website, if there's like a ton of need to get data, but if it's just like one little piece of thing that I want to build an interface for, like I don't want to enable that big module. And then I have to read the release notes for JSON API and REST every time they come out to make sure it's not going to break or something.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the REST module. I don't have the impression it's much code because like it's pretty, I mean, it seems like it's just a lightweight wrapper on writing your own controller instead of writing your own controller.
Yeah, I remember I looked into it a couple years ago and I was just I thought at the time like I had to use views with it, or maybe it had a plugin for views so that you could use views to query the data. But I don't think REST had like a UI otherwise for configuring what you needed, right? It was like you have to write custom plugins or something.
Yeah, you write a plugin that basically implements the logic, and you write a config object basically that enables it, which is it's a little bit of an annoying system. So,
yeah. So my view has become like most of the Drupal modules, like popular contrib modules, are developed under the assumption that like you want a UI to like configure something and like make it easy for someone to use like off the shelf.
Yeah.
And it solves like the 80% use case or whatever. But like when we're developing like our platform, our website hosting platform, where I just don't want like the extra baggage of all of the stuff that like presents the UI to like do things and have all the extra features that we're never going to use. It's just like less lines of code that are running, But again, my use cases are so far quite limited to when I do this, and it's just like a simple controller or two that like returns like a small amount of data.
Yeah.
We've had problems in the past where like our developers have just enabled a ton of contrib modules to do like one simple little thing, right? And I'm like, it's just like 5 lines of code if you just write it yourself.
Yeah, no. I know that problem. Like I forced us to implement a rule of like, if you want to add a new module, you have to like write a justification as to why like you can't write the 5 lines of custom code.
Yeah.
But yeah,
one thing I didn't like about JSON API is like you turn it on and it basically opens up everything to JSON API. I guess there might be another module you can do to restrict it. But like basically
or you write
everything,
a little custom code, yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess in theory that's not a bad thing because like someone should be able to like visit the normal HTML version of that content if it's public too, It's just not as consumable as if it were in JSON API, and just like kind of freaked me out a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think,
Probably
yeah, we also
needlessly.
turn on the REST module probably because you can get, you know, a reasonable, you know, JSON representation of a single entity out that way.
Hmm.
And I forget why. There were like some things we needed to do that have, like, an example was an entity that had a reference field, you know, where we might have had like a, 5,000 entity references that we needed to render
Whoa.
into JSON.
Wow.
And so it was like, you know, it was like easier to tweak and customize that stuff. Then you wanted like, just give me the entity, but then like, okay, I have to customize the, you know, the way the entity reference field with 5,000 references renders so it doesn't
Well,
die.
yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's, yeah, we're actually trying to tell our customers that if they want your programmatic access to the data, they have to use JSON API for the most part, which is kind of fun. I mean, it's all authenticated access, but
Right.
like try to write up like a guide to like getting your data out using JSON API is it's
Yeah.
not really user friendly.
No. Yeah, because I mean, but at least there's like there's a JSON API schema that defines like how to query the data, right? So like how to build the query string in your request. So like,
Yeah,
okay, I want this field data, but they would need to understand like the machine names of the various fields they want access to,
right,
right?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think JSON API itself clearly defines all this stuff, but I mean, like the Drupal.org docs are pretty good. But it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, because Wim was involved in them.
probably, yeah. And some other like lullaby people, yeah, so I mean, but yeah, again, it's like, you know how it is with like any kind of customer. I'm sure the same with you is, you know, they're like, I want this programmatic stuff, but like, you know, you know, I don't know how to test something with curl or to like generate a JWT with a current timestamp or, right, you know, it's like, good
Yeah.
luck.
Yeah, it's a very technical thing.
Right, yeah,
Hmm.
not for the faint
We
of
should
heart.
have a talk. We should have a talk about JWTs.
I did one a couple months
Oh, you
ago.
did?
You just don't
Here at
attend
the
frequently enough.
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
I
it depends. I feel like if I must have missed that email because I usually like attend based on like the topic.
yeah,
That's why I went tonight because like we're in the middle of the Google Analytics stuff. I was like, oh,
yeah.
that's interesting. So
There's at least
Well-
one, if not two, YouTube videos of Peter's presentation.
oh, okay.
It's not that exciting if you know anything about it already. It was pretty good. Like, what is a JWT level?
What is it?
Yeah.
You're not are you using JWTs for like session management or like user authentication?
We're using it for authentication. Well, that's like how we drive like our Vue JS front ends talking to the Drupal 9 backend.
Oh, okay.
Like, so we, you know,
So
we
my
have,
very limited knowledge of using JWTs that way is like the one problem with it is like it's harder to revoke access like once the JWT has like been given out because like that represents like their access. If they have that token and it's valid for like 15 minutes or something, they have to
Yeah.
keep renewing it every 15 minutes, right? If you make it like valid for a day, there's no way to revoke that person's access if it's valid for
Sure.
a day, right?
yeah,
Otherwise, right. That's the only downside I remember reading about, but otherwise it seemed like really interesting tech.
yeah. I mean, I don't know why you would need to revoke it unless they somehow lost it. I mean, if the user is blocked, it's easy enough to block them, right? So we're giving them the JWT linked to their specific user ID,
Right.
right? So when the access goes to the back end, we actually do all the Drupal like access controls based on what user they are and what roles they have.
Right.
So it's not that they get like a blank slate, you know, to access the
Gotcha.
backend data. So.
All right. Well, I gotta run. It was
All
good
right,
seeing you
well, it
guys.
is 9, yeah.
All right, everybody. Thanks for
Have a good
coming
night.
out.
Have a good night,
I'll
everyone.
post a video and maybe we'll see y'all next month. One of these days, maybe we'll actually see people in person.
Yeah, maybe,
That's a crazy idea.
We should have like a happy hour or something.
yeah,
Before the weather changes, then it goes from sweltering hot to freezing cold.
right, in one day, yeah.
Yeah. All right, everybody.
All right.
Thanks
Good
again.
night.
Have a
Good
good
night.
night.
Good night.
You guys.